I cut out all my pieces to rough dimension, larger than what the final dimension will be. And then I got busy with some other things for a couple of weeks, which is good because these have now had a chance to acclimatize to their new dimensions and to the shop humidity. So when I mill them to their final dimensions, they won't warp or twist anymore. Bottom of the lower leg, which would be in contact with the floor, is the dotted line, solid line for the top. And the taper on the sides will stop 5 inches from the top of this piece. Taper on the back will go all the way up. Okay, I've marked the center of the end of the piece of wood just with diagonal lines to the corners and then put a little indent in. Okay, this is a lower leg piece that I just marked that center on, and I'll put it on this end of the taper sled. I'll put a link below to the taper sled and links to all the other sleds and fixtures I use in this video. And according to my drawing for that lower leg piece, I want to take 1/16 off this end, which is right here. So this has to overhang by 1/16 of an inch. And then I want to stop 5 inches from the top. So up here, I want it to begin cutting about 5 inches from the top there. And then I'll lock the fence in place. So there's my 5-inch pencil mark, just kind of flush there. And I can measure here, I'm overhanging by 1/16 of an inch. So I'll lock that sled in place. 3 clamps hold that piece down and in place. This strip of wood on top is only to ensure that the force is applied to the center of this piece. Without this, the force would all be applied to the edge, and that would tip it a bit. And over here I've got a block of wood with a finishing nail driven through it, so the point of the nail goes into that indent in the bottom of this piece of wood, and then with that block comfortably resting there, I clamp it in place. To position the piece to cut the taper on the other side, I can just flip it over, and instead of relying on the fence, I'll rely on the nail to get the exact spot, and that'll give me the same taper. Up at this end, I can rely on the fence. So looking from the top here, there's a gap of about 1/16 of an inch there, because that's how much we cut off this piece. But I still get the 1/16 of an inch overhang here, because I'm using the nail instead of the fence. So we've got 1/2 inch at the bottom and the full 5/8 inch at the top that we started with. And that 5/8 inch remains for the top 5 inches or so. I'll leave this board with the nail clamped in place until I've done all the pieces that have the same taper. Then they'll all come out the same. With the fence in the same position, I'm cutting a wedge from a scrap of wood that I'll use in the next step. So here's those pieces cut with the taper on both sides, but not up here. So this is straight, and then they go out to the taper. Next, I want to cut a taper on the back. So I'm going to mark these as what will be the outside. For the taper on the back, I want to take off 0.11 inches, and that taper will go the full length. Okay, I've adjusted the fence so that this end is flush with the cut. This end is hanging out by 0.11 inches. This is the bottom of the piece of wood that has the indent punched in it, and the part that I marked as outside is facing against the fence. So I'll be cutting a taper on the back of the piece towards the bottom. I don't need this little board with the nail because I'm just doing one shot. I won't be rotating after this. Now I can do the next pieces with the fence in the same position, always checking that I've got the bottom facing down here, and I've got the part that I marked outside facing towards the fence. And they will all come out the same. When the lamp's assembled, these legs will be at a 9-degree angle, so I want to cut a 9-degree slope on the bottom of that leg so that it sits flat on the floor. An easy way to do that is with the miter gauge set at the 9 degrees. The dashed line shows the bottom cross section of the upper leg piece, and the solid line shows the top cross section of the upper leg piece. And all of the taper is on one side. The taper on these pieces will be on the outer surface, not on the inner surface here, so just outer surface and on the back. So I've marked the outside to know not to cut taper there. I'm going to mark an X on each side to know that's where I want to cut the taper, on the sides and then on the back. So for the side taper, I want to take off 0.055 inches. I made a little improvement to this taper jig. I turned the holes into slots so I can slide this back and forth and get it positioned exactly where I want over the center of the piece of wood. And that saves me having to use this stick. Okay, I've got the top flush. I've got an overhang here of 0.055 inches. And I've got the X facing out because that's the part I want the taper to be on. I've got 6 of these to do, and they'll go very quickly now that the fence is set up on the sled. The next taper is on the back of these pieces, the goal being to bring them flush with this piece. I need to remove 0.096 inches, but to get a more accurate number, I'll measure right off these pieces. So the top piece is 0.937 at the end, and what I'll do is I'll just zero that and let the calipers do the subtraction. And now I'll measure the thickness at the 5" from the top of the lower leg, and that gives me a difference of 0.125, 1/8 of an inch, that I'd want to remove from the upper leg to make them flush. And just to give myself some reassurance, that is what I measure with a ruler. Okay, I put this outer edge that I've marked with the O facing the fence, and I put the bottom of the piece towards the end here. I've got the fence adjusted so that it's flush up here and an overhang of 1/8 of an inch at the bottom. For clamping, I've found that this piece of wood is lower than the fence, so the clamp doesn't hit it, so I'll just put a scrap on there to make that work. Now with that taper cut on the back, the surfaces line up nicely. To make this look less abrupt, I'll cut 45-degree angles on these pieces. I've got a stop block clamped onto the fence here so that every piece will come out the exact same length. Okay, I've marked the drill point holes 1/2 inch back from this edge and 1/2 inch back from that edge and in the center. And the total overlap from this tip to here is 5 inches. I want to join these pieces together with these furniture connector nuts, and they will line everything up. So it's important to get everything lined up before I drill the holes. I've got these pieces oriented so that the outer surface marked with the O is the same for them all. Then I'm going to flip that over because I want that outer surface to be the dead flat surface. The inner surface would be less noticeable. Then I've got a line 5 inches in from the end here and 5-inch marks from the tip there to there. So I'll line up those 5-inch marks. I'm pushing this down on the table and then clamp that. Then out at this end I've got a filler that's the same width as this to get that nice and straight. And then I'll check that this is square, which it's slightly off. So I've corrected that. I'll get another clamp on here just to keep everything nice. I've got a 9mm drill bit, which is just the right size to take the barrel of that connector. I'm adjusting the stop on the drill press so that it won't go all the way through. Just the tip of the brad point drill will come through, and then I can complete the hole from the other side. And that way I'll avoid a lot of tear out. I put enough clamps on here that I can remove one at a time without throwing everything out of alignment. And that's to expose the place where the hole will be drilled. And that fits in there nice. Now I can flip this over, and there's the hole that poked through. Now I can put this clamp back on and remove this clamp to expose the other hole. In order that I can get all these pieces back together the same way, I'm going to mark the orientation. So say A goes with A and B goes with B. The leg joined together with furniture connectors. To my eye, the leg looks too thick in the middle here. So I'm going to increase the taper on these top pieces. My original design was to take off 0.055. I'll try changing that to taking off 0.07 and leaving 0.4 remaining. Here's a scrap of wood 0.4 inches thick. I'll just lay that on top of the original piece, and that shows how much I want to remove. On the sled, I can use the same 0.4 inch thick scrap of wood to set the fence at the right position. And I want to remove the material from the outside of the leg, so I'll always have this bevel facing out. So there's my new dimension, very close to 0.4 inches. With the fence in the same position, I'll do the remaining 5 pieces. On the bottom is the original, and on the top is the thinner taper. So I've got a 30-60 square here, drafting square. I'm setting my board on there. This is a straight edge, so that'll be one side of the triangle. Then here I'll cut the second side of the triangle. And we get a perfect triangle with all 3 sides the same length. And I made 2 of those triangles. I'm going to need the center point of the triangle later, so I'll mark that now. To cut the dovetails in the bottom of these pieces, I've got a stop on this crosscut sled on the rudder table. Then I can just slip that right in there, clamp it, and then slide in. And on this side I've got a stop block, so that'll stop me from going past the center. And I'm starting just with a straight 5/16 inch rudder bit to hog out most of the material before I switch over to the dovetail bit. So that's kind of a way of getting 2 passes, because you can't get 2 passes with a dovetail bit. You've got to do it all in one shot. To stop this long grain from being torn out by the router bit, I'll attach a sacrificial piece with double-sided tape. Okay, I've got a dovetail bit in place. The height is set so that it'll cut to a depth of 3/8 inch. This is a 17/32 diameter bit with a 7-degree slope. 1/2 inch would be fine. I have not moved my stop block, so when I place the piece on here, it'll be perfectly lined up. And that gave a perfect cut with no tear out at all. Now, using this center point that I marked earlier, I can draw a circle. Okay, this circle is tangent to the edges of the triangle. So if I cut along another tangent line to the circle at the 3 points, then I'll get a perfect hexagon. And I want that tangent line to be parallel to the edge of the triangle. So I've got it pushed up against a block of wood that has a square end. I've got a little wedge in here. Then I'll clamp it down, run that over the blade. A 1-inch diameter hole. The dovetails on the left were cut in the same way as the dovetails on the right piece, but instead of cutting it as a hexagon, it was cut as a circle. I'm adjusting the fence and the height of the router bit until I get a perfect fit. And when it's set right with the scraps of wood, then I can go on to the good piece of wood. This piece, I have the grain running this way, dovetail at the top, and I want to cut out slices at a 9-degree angle, which is the angle of the legs. The legs will join on like that, and I want the thickness of this piece here in the middle to be 5/8, because that's the thickness of the piece that goes down here for the lower leg. And the piece that I'm going to cut off here at the 9-degree angle, I want to be the width of this upper leg. So I'm cutting at the 9-degree angle, and I'm taking advantage of the grain actually flowing a little off of perpendicular. So I'll have this piece running along the grain nicely. I've got the miter gauge set to 9 degrees. I'm trimming these off to the correct length. I've got a block here so that I can use the fence as a reference to get them all the same. Then I slide the block out of the way when I move in, and that gives lots of room for this piece to fall away without getting caught between the fence and the blade. I've got a thin credit card here in order to kind of wedge this down so that the clamp doesn't tend to pull it up. I want it flat on the surface of the table. So I've got 1 inch from here to here. A couple of points to mention. I softened up all these edges before I glued these pieces in, all the exposed edges, either with a round over bit or a bit of sandpaper. And another thing is, I've glued these pieces in a little farther than might seem natural, and that's because I'm going to shave off this at the same 9-degree angle as the leg when they're dry. I've got this table tilting down at 9 degrees, and I'll sand off here to get that flush and at the same angle as the little leg. Putting the 9-degree taper on all 6 sides. And now I want to cut dovetails on this piece so that can slide in there. So I've set up a stop block to control the distance of the dovetail. I made these pieces longer than needed because it was easier to process the joints on them when they're longer. And what I'll do is I'll cut them off to their exact position once I've got the lamp all assembled. The long dowel will slide through these 3 pieces. The top piece will be secured to the dowel, but the bottom 2 pieces, the dowel is to slide through easily. So I'm enlarging these holes very slightly, and the top hole I will not enlarge. I'm drilling a 9mm hole through the top of the leg, both pieces. Got a scrap of wood in here to prevent tear out when the drill bit exits the piece on top. And I got 2 pieces of wood here clamping so that the pieces are perfectly aligned this way. Set on the drill press so that it won't go all the way through, and a clamp on top holding it down. So that gives me a hole with just the tip of the bit pointing through that I can now. Now I'll transfer the center of these holes to the right spot on these pieces. And to do that, I've got a bunch of clamps here which I'll explain. The red clamp is keeping the 2 pieces of the upper leg in alignment this way. The blue clamp is squeezing them together around the post. And the 2 gray clamps here are keeping the outer edge of the leg aligned with the outer edge of the post. Also, it's important to check that the outer edge of the leg here is on the outside there, and the outer edge of the leg is the one that goes to the point. This is at the foot. I'm just drilling enough to make a point in the wood. I don't actually want to drill the hole. I'm marking each side. Another thing to show is I've labeled with letters in here and on the post so that they go together properly. When I was drilling for these holes, the furniture connector projects through the material, so I went with the 9mm thick hole all the way through. But here at the top of the leg, the furniture connector does not project through because the material is thicker. Remember, it's tapered. So if I were to drill a 9mm hole through this post, it would end up being a sloppy fit. Therefore, I'll drill a 1/4 inch hole because that's the diameter of the threaded rod that goes between the furniture connectors. I'd probably be okay to drill this all the way through, but I'm stopping before I even begin to exit because I want to drill from both sides. I don't know if those points that I put on are perfectly lined up. Now I've got that flipped over, and just a quick check that the rod goes in nicely. Okay, that's how it looks so far. The next step will be to fit this piece in. An option is to round off the ends of these pieces if you prefer that look. And to go along with that look, you could round off this piece here as well, but I think I'll leave them straight. The lamp is upside down, and from the center point of this to here, I've got 6 5/8 inches. Not a critical number, but you want them all the same. And so I've drawn a pencil line across there at that 6 5/8. And then I've adjusted this centerpiece so that it intersects that line on all 3 legs. Next step is to drill a hole in each side to accommodate a furniture connector. And we want a 9mm hole. The clamps keep everything in place once I've got it set to the correct position. And here I'm checking that I've got an equal distance from the outside of each leg to the next leg. 15 3/4 inches here. Works nice. And finally I check that the distance from the leg to the center there is the same on each one, 2 inches. Just marking the center point for the drill by eyeball, kind of halfway up here, halfway across. So over here at the drill press I got a block of wood where this surface is parallel to the other surface. Got that registered there, then slide this block in to support it. And I've got this depth stop set so that I'll drill through this piece but not through the other piece. The 9mm hole I drilled from only one side of each leg, and now I'm going to drill all the way through with a 1/16 inch drill bit to line up for the 9mm hole on the other side. Okay, I've got the drill bit lined up with the 1/16 inch hole that came through. So when I drill down here with the 9mm, it should line up with the 9mm on the other side. The last hole to drill is 1/4 inch for the threaded rod that'll join the connectors together. And I'm going to drill from each side with the depth stop set so that I just kind of go halfway through the piece. And that'll kind of align, if there's any misalignment, that'll align it with each 9mm hole. So how long should the threaded rod be? Measure this distance and subtract 3/8 of an inch from that to get the correct length for the threaded rod. Okay, these feel too tight in the 9mm hole for me. Maybe my 9mm drill bit is undersized or something. So I've got a 23/64 drill bit, which is slightly above 9mm, and I'll just enlarge these holes. I've got a black mark to know when to stop. Okay, that feels much better. I'm also going to enlarge the center hole with a 17/64 drill bit, which is 1/64 larger than a 1/4 inch. I've got all the connectors in, so I don't need the clamps. And now I'll mark where I want to cut these pieces to be flush. As I take this apart, I'm marking with letters the mating surfaces because each of these holes will be slightly different in how it's centered. I want it all to go back together nicely. When I measure the angle of that line that I scribed, it comes out to 10 degrees, maybe a hair less. So I'll set the table saw to 10 degrees or a hair less. I've got an old sled here that I don't care much about, so I let it cut the 10-degree bevel on the edge of the sled, which kind of messes it up for other purposes. And then I've got a piece of wood here with 90-degree corners, and I'll just fit that in there so it's flush with the bevel. I'll secure that with double-sided tape, and then I can use this as a reference to make my cut and keep that cut perpendicular this way but angled that way. So running that blade along this piece I added gives me a good reference that I can just bring the line right up to and know that I'll make the cut perfect right there. I temporarily added a toggle clamp that I can hold that in there, clamp down. Safe and accurate. All back together, and these fit flush. This leg is sticking out a little bit at the top. Don't know if you can see it there. So I'm just going to try planing off a bit with a very fine setting on the plane. Not important, it's just my personality. And I think that's close enough. I want a dowel to go through here, then the lamp rod will go inside the dowel. The wire will come up here from the plug and into the lamp socket. But drilling a long hole through a dowel is next to impossible. So what I did is I cut a dado in 2 pieces of wood, then glued them together. So that gives me a square hole that fits the lamp rod. And then I'll turn that into a dowel. If you've got a lathe, I don't need to show you how to turn that into a cylinder. But if you don't have a lathe, you've probably got a router. I've cut a piece of square material that fits snug in that hole. Here's a router lathe that I just quickly made up by screwing together some scraps of wood. The router can slide along there while I rotate the piece with this clamp. And the bearings are just those square stock driven into the piece of wood there, riding in round holes so they fit snug. I'm just using a flat bit. So you can see that just took off the sharp edge. Do that on all 4 corners, and then I'll raise the bit a little. Do it again until I finally get a cylinder of the right diameter. I found the router would catch, so I added these runners just to keep it centered, and then it's a lot less effort. I drilled a hole in a scrap of wood same diameter as this hole, then cut it off, and I can use that as a test gauge. Up till now I've been using this bit, which you can see when I shine the light behind it does not have a flat bottom cut. So I'm going to switch to this bit, I think has a flatter bottom. So what I'm doing here is turning down just one end so that I can use the test piece and see if I'm at the right diameter, rather than doing the whole thing and then finding I went too far. And I'm doing that at both ends in case this is not perfectly parallel. The ends are going to get cut off anyway, so if I go too far, it doesn't matter. Pretty close. I mean, I have to push that on a little, but I think I'm going to stop there, run it up and down, take it out of the jig, and then I'll probably be doing a bit with sandpaper anyway to get it good and smooth. Okay, looks like I'm there with my check gauge. So there's my square hole in the round dowel. It's a little tight right now, but I'm going to sand this to get the marks off from the router bit, and then it'll probably fit good. Before I disassemble these pieces to apply the finish, I'm going to mark the areas where I want to round over the sharp edge. And I'll finish up with a file into the parts that I can't reach with the router bit. I secured the disc with a dowel pin, 3 of them actually, and that drops in here. And the distance above here depends on the style of lampshade you have and the lamp hardware. So get all of that stuff first before you attach this on here. This piece is called the harp. They come in different sizes. You can get them from a lamp store or Home Depot or whatever. And then I've got a threaded rod going all the way through to the bottom. I found these brass washers on Amazon. And then you could have some kind of brass thing on here with a hole in it at from a lamp parts store. I made this one out of wood. It's got a little recess to cover the nut that goes on here. There it is, put together with a hole in the bottom for the wire. I find this screw-in style of socket is much nicer than the old snap-in style.